Thomas Wilson woke up early that morning, just as the first light of dawn filtered through the bedroom curtains. He turned to look at his wife Claire, still peacefully asleep beside him. Even after 15 years of marriage, he sometimes caught himself staring at her like this, wondering how he got so lucky. The soft morning light cast a gentle glow on her face, highlighting the few strands of silver that had begun to appear in her dark hair. Thomas didn't mind those small signs of aging. If anything, they reminded him of the beautiful journey they'd shared together. "Stop staring," Claire mumbled without opening her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. Thomas laughed softly. "Can't help it," he said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Happy anniversary." Claire's eyes fluttered open, bright and alert despite having just woken up. 15 years, she said, reaching up to touch his face. Who would have thought? It was their anniversary tradition to spend the morning reminiscing about how they met. Thomas had been designing a new children's wing for the hospital where Claire worked as a pediatrician. They'd bumped into each other, quite literally, in the hospital cafeteria, sending Claire's coffee spilling all over his blueprints. "I still feel bad about those drawings," Claire said as they shared breakfast on their patio overlooking the garden she had lovingly tended for years. "Best thing that ever happened to them," Thomas replied, refilling her coffee cup. The redesign was much better anyway. Their friends often called them the perfect couple, and Thomas couldn't disagree. They lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs of Boston that Thomas had designed himself. Claire's work-saving children's lives balanced perfectly with his creative architectural pursuits. They hosted dinner parties where guests left saying they'd had the best time of their lives. They traveled to new countries every year, with Claire somehow always knowing the most interesting hidden spots to visit. After breakfast, Thomas presented Claire with a small box. Inside was a vintage locket he'd found at an antique shop downtown. "Open it," he encouraged. Claire carefully opened the locket to find a tiny photo of their first apartment together, the small one-bedroom place they'd rented when they first got married. "Thomas," she whispered, eyes shining, "how did you ever find a photo that would fit in here?" "I have my ways," he said, pleased by her reaction. "Do you remember that place? The broken heater, the neighbors who fought all night, and the window with the perfect view of the sunrise," Claire added, fastening the locket around her neck. "Some of our best days." Thomas agreed, though he thought every day with Claire ranked among his best. His gift seemed to bring out a nostalgic mood in Claire. As they walked through their neighborhood later that morning, she spoke more about their early days together than she had in years. "You never gave up on me, even when I was working those impossible hospital shifts," she said as they strolled hand in hand past houses where they knew every neighbor by name. "You were saving lives. How could I complain about that?" Claire squeezed his hand. "Most men would have. You know, in all these years, I've never once heard you say you wished things were different, even about the children." Thomas felt a familiar pang at the mention of children. They'd tried for a few years early in their marriage, but it hadn't happened for them. Eventually, they decided that Claire's young patients and Thomas's buildings would be their legacy instead. "I have everything I need," Thomas said honestly. "Besides, you give enough love to those kids at the hospital for 10 people. Claire's patients adored her. Thomas had seen it firsthand at hospital functions, the way children's faces lit up when they saw her, how parents looked at her with such gratitude. Just last month, a mother had approached them in a restaurant, tears in her eyes as she thanked Claire for saving her daughter's life 3 years earlier. Claire had handled it with her usual grace, but Thomas noticed how she quickly changed the subject when the woman asked about where she'd studied medicine in Europe. Claire had grown up somewhere in Switzerland, or sometimes she mentioned France or Germany. The details seemed to shift, but she rarely spoke about her life before coming to America. Early in their relationship, Thomas had asked more questions about her past, curious about the woman he was falling in love with. Claire had always given vague answers before skillfully turning the conversation back to him or to their shared future. Eventually, Thomas had stopped asking. He figured everyone had a right to keep some parts of themselves private, even from those closest to them. After their walk, they drove to the small Italian restaurant where they'd had their first official date. The owner, Carlo, greeted them like old friends, showing them to their table by the window. 15 years, Carlo exclaimed, bringing them complimentary glasses of champagne. You two are my favorite love story. Thomas raised his glass to Claire. To the most amazing 15 years and to many more. Claire clinked her glass against his, her eyes holding his gaze. To us, she said simply. As they enjoyed their meal, Thomas found himself watching Claire as she spoke about one of her young patients who had finally gone into remission after a long battle with leukemia. Her face came alive when she talked about her work, her hands moving expressively. She had a way of making everyone around her feel special, included, valued. It was what made her such an excellent doctor and such a wonderful wife. What? Claire asked, noticing his stare. Nothing, Thomas said. Just thinking about how lucky I am. Claire's expression softened. I'm the lucky one, she said, and there was something in her voice, a slight catch, a hint of some deeper emotion, that made Thomas reach across the table to take her hand. That evening, they hosted a small gathering at their home, just a few close friends to celebrate their anniversary. Thomas noticed how effortlessly Claire moved among their guests, remembering details about everyone's lives, making each person feel like they were the most important one in the room. Their friend David raised a toast. To Thomas and Claire, the couple that makes the rest of us believe perfect marriages aren't just in fairy tales. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses, but Thomas caught a strange expression flicker across Claire's face, something almost like guilt, before she smiled and thanked everyone for coming. Later, after their friends had gone and they were cleaning up together, Thomas asked, "Is everything okay? You seemed a little quiet toward the end of the night." Claire looked up from the dishes she was rinsing. "Just tired, I think. And maybe a little emotional. 15 years is a long time." Thomas wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "The best 15 years." Claire leaned back against him. "I want you to know something," she said softly. "Whatever happens, whatever you might learn about me someday, I've loved you completely. That's always been real." Thomas turned her around to face him, confused by her words. "Claire, what are you talking about?" She shook her head, a smile replacing the serious expression. "Nothing. Just getting sentimental in my old age." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing his features as if memorizing them. "Let's go to bed." That night, as Claire slept beside him, Thomas lay awake thinking about their life together. There were parts of Claire that remained mysterious to him, even after all these years. Sometimes he caught her staring out windows with a faraway look, or speaking on the phone in rapid French when she thought he wasn't home. Once he'd come across an old photo of her that had fallen from a book, Claire standing in front of a building he didn't recognize, her arm around a woman whose face had been carefully cut out of the picture. When he'd asked about it, Claire had taken the photo with a surprised look and said simply, "Old ghosts," before changing the subject. But these small mysteries didn't trouble Thomas. Everyone had a past, and whatever Claire's had been, she'd chosen to build her future with him. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Thomas thought again about how lucky he was to have married the perfect woman. He had no way of knowing that in less than a year, everything he believed about their perfect life together would be called into question by a single discovery. A hidden briefcase that contained secrets Claire had kept buried for 15 years. 6 months after their anniversary celebration, Thomas noticed that Claire had been unusually tired. At first, they both brushed it off as the result of long hours at the hospital. Claire had been working on a particularly difficult case, a 6-year-old boy with a rare blood disorder, and had been staying late most evenings. "You should take a day off," Thomas suggested one morning as he watched Claire push her breakfast around her plate without eating much. "Maybe we could drive up to that little bed and breakfast on the coast." Claire smiled faintly. "That sounds nice, but I really need to be there for Andy's treatment this week." She winced slightly as she stood up from the table, her hand going to her side. Thomas frowned. "Are you in pain?" "Just a stitch," she said. "Probably from running up all those hospital stairs yesterday." But a week later, the pain hadn't gone away. If anything, it seemed worse, though Claire tried to hide it. Thomas finally put his foot down when he found her doubled over in the bathroom one morning. "You're seeing a doctor today," he said firmly. "And not just talking to one of your colleagues in the hallway. A proper appointment." Claire looked like she wanted to argue, but nodded instead. "You're right. I'll talk to Dr. Richardson today." Thomas insisted on driving her to the hospital that morning. As he kissed her goodbye in the parking lot, he felt an unexpected wave of dread wash over him. Call me after you see Richardson, he said. Claire squeezed his hand. Don't worry so much. It's probably just an ulcer from too much hospital coffee. But it wasn't an ulcer. When Thomas's phone rang that afternoon, he knew from Claire's voice that something was very wrong. Can you come back to the hospital? She asked, her voice unnaturally calm. Dr. Richardson wants to talk to both of us. The drive back to the hospital was a blur. Thomas found Claire waiting for him in the lobby, her face pale but composed. She took his hand without speaking and led him to Dr. Richardson's office. The words washed over him like cold water. Advanced pancreatic cancer, stage 4, spread to the liver. Treatment options, statistics, time frames. Thomas heard himself asking questions, saw Claire nodding at certain points, but it all felt unreal, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. How long? He finally asked when Dr. Richardson paused. The doctor's kind eyes flickered between them. With aggressive treatment, perhaps 6 to 9 months. Without intervention, 3 to 4. Claire, using her doctor's voice, asked detailed questions about treatment plans, success rates, and quality of life considerations. Thomas just held her hand, feeling like he might shatter into a million pieces if he let go. In the car afterward, they sat in silence for a long time, the engine off, staring through the windshield at the hospital where Claire had saved so many lives. I don't want the aggressive treatment, Claire finally said, her voice steady. It won't change the outcome, just how I spend the time I have left. Thomas wanted to argue, to insist they try everything, fight with everything they had. But looking at Claire, clear-eyed, resolute, already accepting what he couldn't bear to face, he knew she was making this decision as both a doctor and a patient. Whatever you want, he said, his voice breaking. We'll do this however you want. Claire reached over and placed her palm against his cheek. My brave Thomas, I'm so sorry to put you through this. The next few months passed in a strange blur of normal moments interspersed with the increasingly impossible-to-ignore reality of Claire's illness. She continued working as long as she could, reducing her hours gradually rather than stopping all at once. Her colleagues at the hospital created a schedule that allowed her to see her long-term patients for proper goodbyes without exhausting her. At home, Thomas did everything he could to make life continue as normally as possible, while quietly taking on more and more of the household responsibilities as Claire's strength waned. They still had dinner together every night, still watched their favorite shows curled up on the couch, still laughed together, though sometimes the laughter would catch in Thomas's throat when he remembered what was coming. Through it all, Claire maintained a quiet dignity that amazed Thomas. She used her medical knowledge not to fight the inevitable, but to prepare them both for what was ahead. At night, when she thought he was asleep, Thomas sometimes heard her crying softly in the bathroom. But in the morning, she always met the day with calm acceptance. As her condition worsened, Claire began putting her affairs in order with methodical precision. She organized all their important documents, wrote letters to close friends and colleagues, and spent hours at her desk in the home office with the door closed. What are you working on in there? Thomas asked one evening as he brought her a cup of tea. Claire closed a file folder before he could see its contents. Just making sure everything will be simple for you afterward, she said. I don't want you to have to worry about paperwork while you're grieving. There was something in her tone that struck Thomas as odd, but he was too exhausted from the emotional strain of watching his wife fade away to question it further. 3 months after the diagnosis, Claire was mostly confined to their bed. A hospice nurse came daily, but Thomas handled most of her care himself. He took a leave of absence from work, wanting to be present for every moment they had left. One night, as he helped her take her pain medication, Claire gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Listen to me, she said, her blue eyes intense despite the hollowness that had overtaken her face. After I'm gone, I need you to promise me something. Anything, Thomas said. Don't grieve too long. Remember me as I was, not like this. And when you go through my things, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Everything is organized. Follow my instructions exactly, okay? It's all written down in my desk. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Claire's grip relaxed. I need you to know that I've loved you completely, Thomas. Whatever happens after, whatever you might learn, that has always been true. It was the second time she'd said something like that, and again Thomas wanted to ask what she meant. But Claire's eyes were already drifting closed as the medication took effect, and he didn't want to disturb her rest. The end came peacefully one rainy Tuesday morning. Thomas was holding Claire's hand, telling her about the garden plans for spring when he realized her breathing had changed. He looked up to see her watching him with a small smile. "Thomas," she whispered, "you were the best part of my life." And then she was gone, slipping away so quietly that for a moment Thomas wasn't sure if she was really gone or just sleeping. The hospice nurse confirmed what his heart already knew. Claire had left him. The funeral was held 3 days later. The hospital chapel was packed with Claire's colleagues, patients, families, and friends. Thomas stood in a daze as person after person approached to tell him how Claire had touched their lives, saved their children, offered comfort when no one else could. Among the mourners, Thomas noticed a few faces he didn't recognize: a tall, distinguished-looking older man who stood at the back of the chapel throughout the service, a woman with short gray hair who wiped tears away as the hospital director spoke about Claire's dedication, a younger man with a slight limp who placed a single white rose on the casket and quickly left without speaking to anyone. When Thomas tried to approach the older man after the service, he seemed to disappear into the crowd. The gray-haired woman gave him a tight smile and murmured, "She spoke of you often," before hurrying away, leaving Thomas to wonder when and where this stranger had known his wife. In the weeks that followed, Thomas moved through grief like a man underwater. He took some comfort in following Claire's meticulous instructions for handling her estate. She'd left detailed directions for everything: who should receive certain personal items, how her medical books should be donated to the hospital's teaching program, which charities should receive a generous donation in her name. Thomas found himself both grateful for her organization and unsettled by it. It was so like Claire to try to control what happened after she was gone, to try to ease his burden, but there was something almost too prepared about it all, as if she'd been planning for this possibility for years rather than months. At night, alone in their bed, Thomas would close his eyes and try to conjure Claire's face, her voice, the feel of her hand in his. Sometimes he imagined he could smell her perfume, something light and elegant that she'd always said reminded her of her mother's garden back in Europe. Thomas realized he didn't even know exactly where Claire had grown up. How strange to have been married to someone for 15 years and not know such a basic fact about them. Had he never asked? Had she never told him? 3 months after the funeral, Thomas knew he needed to clear out Claire's home office. It was the one room he'd avoided touching, the one space still exactly as she'd left it. He'd been following all of her other instructions to the letter, finding some peace in carrying out her wishes. But she'd left no guidance about her office, and Thomas wasn't sure if he was ready to dismantle this last private piece of her. Standing in the doorway of the small room, Thomas took a deep breath and stepped inside. It was time to face whatever was waiting for him there, even if it was just more grief. Thomas stood in the doorway of Claire's home office, taking in the space that had been exclusively hers during their marriage. Unlike the rest of their home, which they had decorated together, this room was purely Claire. The walls were lined with medical textbooks and journals. Framed diplomas and certifications hung in neat rows. Her large oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface still organized just as she'd left it. He moved slowly into the room, running his fingers along the spines of her books. Some were in languages he couldn't read, medical texts in French and German that Claire had sometimes referenced when consulting on difficult cases. A framed photo on the bookshelf showed the two of them on vacation in Italy 5 years ago, laughing as they sat at an outdoor cafe. Thomas picked it up, remembering how Claire had somehow known all the best local spots, speaking fluent Italian with the restaurant owners despite never mentioning she knew the language. There were so many small moments like that throughout their marriage, times when Claire revealed unexpected knowledge or skills that she brushed off with vague explanations. At the time, Thomas had found it charming, even attractive. Now these memories took on a different weight. He set down the photo and turned to her desk. The surface held a neat stack of medical journals, a copper paperweight in the shape of a maple leaf, and the framed photo of their wedding day. Thomas sat in her chair, feeling like an intruder, despite having been her husband for 15 years. The desk drawers were organized with Claire's typical precision: pens and notepads in the top drawer, files arranged alphabetically in the middle drawer, and various office supplies in the bottom. Nothing unusual, nothing that provided any clues about the mysterious comments she'd made before her death. Thomas leaned back in the chair, unsure what he'd been expecting to find. Perhaps he was reading too much into Claire's words. Maybe the stress of her illness had made her say things that didn't really have deeper meaning. He was about to get up when he noticed a small scratch on the wooden panel behind the desk, a mark that seemed out of place in a room Claire kept so meticulously. Standing, Thomas moved the desk chair aside to get a closer look. The scratch was near the bottom of the wood paneling. As he knelt down to examine it, his hand pressed against the panel, and to his surprise, it moved slightly. Heart suddenly racing, Thomas pressed harder and felt the panel give way. It wasn't part of the wall at all, but a false front. Behind it was a small alcove built into the wall, and within that alcove sat a safe. A compact steel box with a digital combination lock. Thomas stared at it in disbelief. He designed this house himself. He'd never included a hidden safe in the plans. Someone had added this later, and given Claire's reaction to any home renovation projects, she hated the dust and disruption. It had to have been installed when he was away on one of his longer business trips. The safe stared back at him, its keypad waiting. Thomas had no idea what the combination might be. He tried Claire's birthday. Access denied. He tried his own birthday. Access denied. Their anniversary? The same result. Thomas sat back on his heels, trying to think like Claire. What number sequence would she choose that she wouldn't forget, but that also wouldn't be obvious to anyone else? He thought about her final instructions, how she'd told him to remember her as she was. On a hunch, he tried the date of their first meeting when she'd spilled coffee on his hospital blueprints. The light on the safe turned green, and he heard a soft click as the lock disengaged. Holding his breath, Thomas pulled open the door. Inside was a single item, an expensive leather briefcase, its surface buttery soft and clearly well made. Attached to the handle was a small envelope with his name written in Claire's elegant handwriting. With trembling hands, Thomas removed the briefcase and the note. He set the briefcase on the desk and carefully opened the envelope. "Thomas," the note began, "when you find this, know that I've always loved you, but there was more to me than you knew. I'm sorry." Thomas read the short note several times, trying to understand what Claire meant. More to her than he knew? After 15 years of marriage, how could there be significant parts of her life he wasn't aware of? The briefcase seemed to grow heavier on the desk as Thomas stared at it. Whatever secrets Claire had kept were inside, waiting for him. Did he even want to know? For a brief moment, he considered putting the briefcase back in the safe, closing the hidden panel and pretending he'd never found it. They'd had a good marriage, a happy life together. Maybe that was enough. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Thomas knew he couldn't walk away. Claire had left this for him to find. She must have wanted him to know the truth, whatever it was. Still, he couldn't bring himself to open it right away. Instead, Thomas carried the briefcase downstairs and set it on the coffee table in the living room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the expensive kind Claire had always given him for his birthday, and sat on the couch, staring at the briefcase as if it might suddenly speak and explain everything. Hours passed. The afternoon light faded into evening, and Thomas still hadn't opened the briefcase. He'd reached for it several times only to pull his hand back at the last moment. Once opened, there would be no going back. Whatever was inside would change how he saw his wife forever. As darkness fell, Thomas finally reached for his phone and called the one person he thought might understand. "Hey, it's me," he said when his oldest friend Paul answered. "I need to talk. Can you come over?" Paul arrived 30 minutes later, his face etched with concern as Thomas let him in. They'd known each other since college, and Paul had been best man at Thomas and Claire's wedding. "What's going on?" Paul asked, eyeing the untouched whiskey and the leather briefcase on the table. "You sounded strange on the phone." Thomas explained about finding the hidden safe in Claire's note. "I haven't opened it yet," he admitted. "I'm afraid of what I'll find." Paul sat down across from him. "You've been through hell these past few months, Tom. Whatever's in there, are you sure you want to know right now?" "No," Thomas said honestly. "But I can't just ignore it either."
"Claire wanted me to find this."
"She must have had a reason." Paul nodded slowly. "Do you want me to stay while you open it?" Thomas considered the offer, then shook his head. "I think this is something I need to do alone. But thanks for coming over. I just needed to tell someone else it was real, you know?" After Paul left, Thomas poured himself a fresh glass of whiskey and sat down in front of the briefcase again. This time he didn't hesitate. He set his drink aside, took a deep breath, and unlatched the case. The first thing he saw was a stack of passports, at least 5 of them from different countries. On top was a Swiss passport. Thomas opened it with unsteady hands and found Claire's photo looking back at him, but the name printed beside it wasn't Claire Wilson. It was Claudia Keller. His stomach tightened as he opened the next one, a French passport identifying his wife as Céline Moreau. The next was German, giving her name as Charlotte Weber. Thomas set the passports aside and continued looking through the briefcase. There were bundles of cash in various currencies, secured with rubber bands. A small pistol wrapped in cloth, which Thomas carefully set aside without touching more than necessary. Several USB drives labeled only with dates. A collection of newspaper clippings in French and German from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Many with handwritten notes in the margins in what he recognized as Claire's handwriting. At the bottom of the case was a sealed envelope from what appeared to be a government agency, though Thomas didn't recognize the insignia. The letter inside thanked Operative Keller for years of service to her country and confirmed the terms of her retirement. The signature at the bottom had been redacted. Thomas's head swam. Operative? Retirement? The Claire he knew was a pediatrician who had gone to medical school in Europe before moving to America for her residency. She'd never mentioned working for any government agency or having multiple identities. Yet here was evidence suggesting his wife had been someone else entirely before becoming Claire Wilson. But which identity was real? Had any of them been real? Thomas returned everything to the briefcase except one photo he found tucked between the pages of a small notebook. It showed a younger Claire, or Claudia, or Céline, or whoever she had been, standing in front of an ornate European building with 3 other people. Unlike the photo he'd found years ago, these faces hadn't been scratched out. Thomas didn't recognize any of them, but they all had the same serious, watchful expression in their eyes that he sometimes caught in Claire when she didn't know he was looking. He stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman he'd loved for 15 years with this stranger, who collected passports and carried concealed weapons. It seemed impossible they could be the same person. Yet something about the revelation didn't feel entirely surprising, as if on some level he'd always sensed there was more to Claire than she revealed. Thomas tucked the photo into his pocket and closed the briefcase. The contents had left him with more questions than answers. Who had his wife really been? What kind of work had she done that required multiple identities? And most importantly, why had she kept it all secret from him? Outside, thunder rumbled as a storm moved in over the city. Thomas moved to the window, watching lightning flash across the night sky. Somewhere in that briefcase were answers about his wife's past, but he would need help understanding them. For the first time since Claire's death, Thomas felt something besides grief taking hold in him, a determination to uncover the truth, no matter what it revealed. Thomas barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the passports with Claire's photo next to unfamiliar names. By morning, his initial shock had hardened into a strange determination. He needed to understand who his wife had really been. He carried the briefcase to the kitchen table and laid out its contents methodically, as if organizing evidence. The passports, the bundles of currency, the newspaper clippings, the gun he still couldn't bring himself to touch, and the USB drives that might contain actual answers. Thomas booted up his laptop and inserted the first drive. It asked for a password. He tried the same date he'd used to open the safe, but it didn't work. He tried other significant dates, Claire's birthday, or at least the one she'd always claimed was her birthday, the day they'd moved into this house, the day she'd started at the hospital. Nothing worked. Frustrated, Thomas tried the second drive. Same result. The third drive, however, opened without requiring a password. It contained a single video file, dated just 1 month before Claire's diagnosis. Thomas's hand hovered over the mouse, his heart hammering in his chest. After a deep breath, he clicked play. Claire's face filled the screen. She was sitting in her office, the very room where he'd found the briefcase. She looked healthy, vibrant, not yet touched by the cancer that would take her life. She was wearing the blue blouse he'd always loved, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked nervous. "Thomas," she began, "if you're watching this, Then you found the briefcase, and I'm no longer here to explain things in person. She paused, swallowing hard. I never wanted you to find out this way. I always planned to tell you everything someday when it was safe. But I kept putting it off, afraid of how you might look at me afterward. And now it seems time has run out for us. Claire took a deep breath. Before I was Claire Wilson, I had other names, other lives. The woman you married, the doctor, the friend, the wife. That's truly who I am now. But it wasn't always who I was. She explained that she had been recruited during her first year of medical school in Switzerland. A professor had approached her about using her skills to serve her country in a different way. She'd been young, idealistic, hungry for adventure. She'd said yes without fully understanding what she was agreeing to. I became an intelligence operative, Claire said simply, not a spy in the Hollywood sense. I never had to seduce diplomats or engage in shootouts. She smiled slightly. Though I did learn to handle a firearm, as you've probably discovered by now. Her work had primarily involved gathering information from sensitive locations, using her medical training as cover. She'd moved between several European countries, adopting new identities as needed. The details of specific operations were still classified, she explained. But most of her work had focused on tracking groups that threatened global security. Terrorist cells, weapons dealers, human trafficking networks. I was good at it, Claire admitted, a hint of pride crossing her face before being replaced by something darker. Too good, perhaps. I stayed in the field longer than most. But there was an incident in 2007 that changed everything. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes intense. I can't share the details, Thomas. I'm still bound by oaths I took. But someone I worked with was killed, someone I was responsible for. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. I requested extraction and retirement. My handlers weren't happy. I knew too much, had too many connections. But eventually they agreed to let me go with conditions. One of those conditions was a complete break from my past. A new identity, a new country, a new life. Thomas paused the video, needing a moment to process what he'd heard so far. Claire, his Claire, had been some sort of intelligence agent? It seemed impossible to reconcile the warm, compassionate doctor he knew with this other person who had lived under multiple names and apparently dealt with terrorists. He pressed play again. I came to America with my new identity fully formed. Claire continued. Claire Wilson, who had completed her medical training in Europe and was looking for a residency program in pediatrics. My background was thoroughly documented. Anyone who checked would find records of a real person who had really attended medical school. She leaned closer to the camera. Then I met you, Thomas. It wasn't part of my plan. I was supposed to keep a low profile, focus on my medical career, avoid forming attachments that might complicate things. But there you were with your coffee-stained blueprints and that crooked smile, and suddenly all the rules seemed less important. Claire's eyes grew misty. Falling in love with you was the first real thing that happened to me after years of living behind masks. Being your wife has been the truest part of all my lives. Thomas felt tears sliding down his cheeks as Claire continued. I've wanted to tell you so many times. There have been moments when the lies felt too heavy to bear, but my former employers made it very clear. My retirement was conditional on my silence. If I ever revealed my past, it would not only put me at risk, but potentially you as well. So I kept quiet, year after year, telling myself it was to protect you. She looked down briefly, then back up with determination. But you deserve the truth, Thomas. That's why I've prepared this briefcase. It contains enough evidence to help you understand who I was, without including details that might put you in danger. Claire explained that the newspaper clippings related to events she'd been involved with, though her role wasn't publicly known. The encrypted USB drives contained more sensitive information, which she couldn't share the passwords for. If Thomas really wanted access, she suggested he might try contacting her former handler, whose details were hidden in a false bottom in the briefcase. I don't expect you to forgive me for keeping this from you, Claire said softly. All these years of half-truths and omissions, I know they amount to a kind of betrayal, but please believe that my love for you was never a lie. The life we built together, the woman I became with you, that's the most authentic version of myself I've ever known. The video ended with Claire looking directly into the camera, her eyes filled with love and regret. Goodbye, Thomas. Whatever you choose to do with this information, know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of all my lives. The screen went black. Thomas sat motionless, tears streaming down his face, trying to absorb everything he'd just learned. Part of him wanted to scream, to rage at Claire for keeping such enormous secrets. Another part recognized the impossible position she'd been in, bound by oaths and obligations that predated their relationship. After sitting in stunned silence for nearly an hour, Thomas returned to the briefcase. He carefully examined the bottom until he found a slight irregularity in the leather. Pressing gently, he felt a panel give way, revealing a hidden compartment containing a single business card. It bore only a phone number and the name Richard. Thomas stared at the card for a long time before setting it aside. He wasn't ready to make that call yet. First, he needed to verify at least some part of Claire's story on his own. He spent the next several days in a research frenzy, carefully examining the newspaper clippings and cross-referencing them with online archives. The articles covered various events across Europe: a hostage situation at an embassy in 1999, the dismantling of a human trafficking ring in 2003, the mysterious death of an arms dealer in 2006. None mentioned Claire or any of her aliases directly, but Thomas noticed small, handwritten marks next to specific paragraphs, details that the public reports had gotten wrong or information that had been deliberately withheld. He also found himself looking back through photo albums with new eyes, noticing small inconsistencies in Claire's stories about her past. The way she sometimes stumbled when talking about her childhood, the lack of any family attending their wedding. She'd claimed her parents had died and she had no siblings, which might have been true of Claire Wilson, but perhaps not of the woman she'd been before. A week after finding the briefcase, Thomas finally worked up the courage to call the number on the business card. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" the man demanded without preamble. "My name is Thomas Wilson," he said, his mouth dry. "I'm Claire's husband." There was a long pause. "Claire doesn't have a husband." "She did," Thomas said quietly. "Claire Wilson did. Before that, she might have been Claudia Keller. Or Céline Moreau." Another pause, longer this time. "Then meet me tomorrow. The coffee shop on the corner of Pine and 4th, 10 a.m. Come alone." The line went dead before Thomas could respond. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, too anxious to sit at home waiting. He ordered a coffee and chose a table near the back with a clear view of the door. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bell over the door chimed, and an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes entered. Thomas recognized him immediately, the distinguished-looking man who had stood at the back of the chapel during Claire's funeral. The man ordered at the counter, then walked directly to Thomas's table and sat down without being invited. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting. "But I suppose that's to be expected." Thomas studied the man across from him, probably in his 60s, expensively dressed with the alert posture of someone used to being aware of his surroundings. "Are you Richard?" Thomas asked. The man nodded once. "For the purposes of this conversation, yes." He took a sip of his coffee. "Claire left instructions in case of her death. She said you might eventually come looking for answers." Thomas leaned forward. "Then you can tell me, was any of it real? Our life together? Or was I just part of her cover?" Richard's expression softened slightly. "Young man, I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've seen operatives maintain covers for decades. None of them keep up the charade after death." He set his cup down. "Whatever she was before, Claire Wilson was real. What she felt for you was real." For the first time since finding the briefcase, Thomas felt something inside him relax. Whatever else he might discover about his wife's past, he needed to believe their love had been genuine. "Now," Richard said, his tone becoming businesslike, "let's discuss what you know so far, and what you actually need to know going forward. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again." Thomas spent the next 2 hours in that coffee shop with Richard, learning fragments of his wife's former life. Richard was careful about what he shared. Some details were still classified, he explained, and others weren't his to tell. "Claire was exceptional," Richard said, stirring his 3rd cup of coffee. "She had this ability to blend in anywhere, to make people trust her instantly." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "It's how she got me to ask her out even after she ruined my blueprints." Richard smiled slightly. "That wasn't a technique. That was just Claire." According to Richard, Claire, or Claudia as he had known her, had been recruited as a medical student because of her language skills and quick thinking. Her work had taken her across Europe, where she'd helped gather intelligence on various threats to national security. She'd never been a field assassin, but she had sometimes been in dangerous situations. The incident in 2007 that she mentioned, Richard said, his expression growing somber. A younger agent was compromised during an operation. Claire tried to extract him, but they were discovered. She made it out. He didn't. Thomas thought about the guilt Claire must have carried all these years. Had there been nights when she'd woken up beside him, haunted by memories she couldn't share? After that, she wanted out. It took some convincing, but eventually, the agency agreed to let her retire with a new identity. The condition was that she never contact anyone from her former life or reveal her past. Richard gave Thomas a pointed look, which is why this conversation is officially not happening. When they parted, Richard handed Thomas a blank business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. "If you need anything or if anyone comes asking questions they shouldn't, call this number." "Thank you," Thomas said, "for telling me about her, for coming to her funeral, even though you couldn't acknowledge who you were." Richard's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "I looked after her for 10 years, watched her become one of our best. I couldn't not be there." He hesitated. "She was happy with you, Thomas. Happier than I'd ever seen her. Whatever else you're feeling right now, try to remember that." The next morning, Thomas woke to an insistent knocking at his front door. He opened it to find a woman in a dark suit standing on his porch, her expression serious but not unfriendly. "Mr. Wilson, my name is Agent Lisa Dawson." She showed him a government ID. "I understand you've recently come into possession of some sensitive materials belonging to your late wife." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "How did you know about that?" "We monitor certain situations," she said vaguely. "May I come in?" Over coffee that Thomas made with shaking hands, Agent Dawson explained that her agency had been alerted when Thomas contacted Richard. "We've respected your grieving process, but now that you've discovered your wife's former occupation, we need to retrieve any classified documents or materials in your possession." "You mean you want the briefcase?" Thomas said. "The briefcase and its contents, yes, particularly the encrypted drives and any operational documents. Your wife's service agreement was quite clear about the handling of such materials after her retirement." Thomas thought about the call with Richard, about the promise to use the number if anyone came asking questions, but something told him this visit was expected, perhaps even arranged. "What if I don't want to give them to you?" he asked, more to gauge her reaction than out of any real intention to keep the materials. Agent Dawson's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Wilson, I understand this is difficult. You've lost your wife and then discovered she wasn't exactly who you thought she was. But keeping these materials won't bring her back and could potentially create security concerns." Thomas considered this. What would holding on to the briefcase really accomplish? The documents and drives contained operational details he couldn't fully understand anyway. They represented the part of Claire's life that had been separate from him, that she had deliberately left behind. "I'll give you the briefcase," he said finally, "but I'd like to keep a few personal items. Photos, letters, things that have meaning only to me." Agent Dawson nodded. "That seems reasonable." An hour later, she left with the briefcase and most of its contents. Thomas kept only the photo of Claire in Europe, her handwritten notes on some of the newspaper clippings, and the video file, which he transferred to his own computer. Agent Dawson assured him that the agency had no interest in interfering with his life further. "Your wife served her country honorably," she said at the door. "Then she chose a new life, one that by all accounts brought her genuine happiness. Not everyone gets that second chance." In the months that followed, Thomas slowly rebuilt his understanding of who Claire had been. He found himself remembering small moments from their marriage with new clarity. The way she always scanned a room when they entered a restaurant, her startled reaction to loud noises, how she would sometimes speak in her sleep in languages he didn't understand. Had she ever truly stopped being Claudia Keller, the intelligence operative? Or had that woman always been a part of who Claire Wilson became? Thomas began to accept that perhaps there wasn't a clear line between those identities. Claire had been all of those women at once: the dedicated doctor, the loving wife, and yes, the skilled agent with a complicated past. 1 year after Claire's death, Thomas established a scholarship in her name at the hospital. It would fund medical education for students who showed exceptional promise in pediatrics. At the small ceremony announcing the scholarship, The hospital director spoke warmly about Claire's dedication to her patients and her mentorship of younger doctors. As people mingled afterward, Thomas noticed a distinguished older man watching from across the room. Not Richard, but someone with the same alert posture and assessing gaze. When their eyes met, the man raised his glass in a small toast. Thomas excused himself from his conversation and made his way across the room. But by the time he reached the spot, the man had disappeared. Outside the hospital, Thomas found a business card tucked under his windshield wiper. On it was written simply, "She was extraordinary in every life she lived." When Thomas returned home that evening, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Nothing was visibly out of place, but some instinct told him someone had been there. He moved cautiously through the house, checking each room until he reached Claire's office, which he had preserved largely as it was. The briefcase that he'd surrendered to Agent Dawson months ago was sitting open on the desk. Heart pounding, Thomas approached it carefully. The classified materials were gone, but in their place was a new envelope he'd never seen before. Inside was a small key and a piece of paper with coordinates written in Claire's handwriting. Thomas searched the coordinates online and found they led to a small coastal town in southern France. Below the coordinates, Claire had written, "Where it all began. If you want to know more." Thomas sat at the desk for a long time, turning the key over in his hands. Was this Claire's final gift to him? A chance to discover where she had come from, to see the place that had shaped the woman she became before she was his wife. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, the salt breeze cooling his face as he watched waves crash against the rocks below. He'd spent 3 days in this beautiful town, following the breadcrumbs Claire had left for him. The key had opened a small safety deposit box at the local bank, containing old photographs of a young Claire with her real family, letters written in her native language, and a deed to a small cottage just outside town. Standing there, looking out at the endless blue of the sea, Thomas felt Claire's presence more strongly than he had since her death. He understood now why she had left this final trail for him to follow. Not to reveal all her secrets, some would remain forever hers alone, but to show him that the woman he had loved had been real all along, just more complex and extraordinary than he had known. "Goodbye, Claire," he whispered to the wind, "or Claudia, or whoever you were before I knew you. Thank you for letting me love you." As Thomas turned to leave, he noticed a woman standing further down the cliff path, her hair blowing in the breeze. For just a moment, her posture and profile reminded him so strongly of Claire that his heart stopped. Then she turned, revealing a face he didn't recognize, and the spell was broken. Some ghosts, Thomas realized, would always remain with him. But that was okay. He was ready now to carry both the Claire he had known and the woman she had been before, not as separate people, but as one complete, complicated, extraordinary person who had chosen to share her second life with him. And that, he decided as he walked back toward the village, had been the greatest gift of all.